We've been taught to travel by checking boxes off an itinerary, but I found that the most memorable parts of a trip were usually the ones that I never planned. They were things that I stumbled across while wandering through a neighborhood, taking a day trip and driving the back road instead of a highway, or following a recommendation from a local that I met. These accidental discoveries only happen when you aren't rushing to the next must-see spot. And that's why I've been drawn to a slower style of travel. Not slow in the sense of spending months crossing the Atlantic on a steamship. That sounds like an utter nightmare to me. Slow in the sense of leaving room for curiosity and the unexpected, to actually experience a place instead of rushing from one attraction to the next. This is the 5th episode of my Vintage Living in a Modern World series, where we rediscover the lost wisdom of the past to solve modern problems. Not because we want to recreate the past exactly, but because there are just often useful lessons hidden in older ways of doing things. And travel is one area where we desperately need a solution. Today we are looking at the vintage mindset of the Grand Tour and the slower paced voyages of the 19th century to find the practical fix for our modern overscheduled vacations. What fascinates me about travel in the past is that people experienced destinations differently than we often do today. Whether they were traveling by train, automobile, or ocean liner, getting somewhere simply took longer. The journey itself was part of the experience. As a result, there was often much more room for discovery. You couldn't look up reviews for every restaurant, watch dozens of videos about your destination, or build a detailed itinerary months in advance. Now, in many ways, modern travel is better. It's faster, easier, more comfortable, and accessible to more people than ever before. But I do think that we've lost a little bit of the mystery, or whimsy, if you will. And that's really what I mean when I talk about slow travel. You might hear about an interesting local site from someone on the train or chatting with someone at a restaurant. You might stop in a quaint town that you found off the main highway because you saw a road sign for it. You might find the most amazing boutique or wander through a local museum in a small town simply because you had the time to do so. While I certainly wouldn't want to give up my modern conveniences, I do think that there's something worth learning from this mindset. Not necessarily traveling the way people did 100 years ago, but approaching travel with a little more curiosity and a little less urgency. One of the first times that I became really aware of this was my very first trip to Europe. My husband and I took a Rick Steves tour, Paris and the heart of France. And looking back, I think that trip really shaped the way that we've traveled ever since. One thing I remember very clearly is that there was this couple on the tour with us who were focused on seeing everything. Every museum, every attraction, every famous site. They had a physical list that they were checking off. Meanwhile, some of my favorite memories were much smaller. We stayed in a small hotel in the 12th arrondissement in Paris, which felt much more like a neighborhood than a tourist district. One day we wandered into a covered market, and tucked away right outside was this wonderful little flea market. Neither of those places were on any list of must-see attractions, but more than 15 years later, it's one of my fondest memories of Paris. I remember walking through the neighborhood and just seeing how people shopped and went about their day. I remember feeling like I was getting a glimpse of just everyday life rather than, checking famous landmarks off of a list. And that's when I started to realize that two people can visit the exact same place and come home with completely different experiences. These days, though, I think we're all being nudged toward having very similar trips. Before we travel somewhere, most of us watch videos, read blog posts, and search for recommendations. I've certainly done that myself. The result is that we're often being directed to the same attractions, the same restaurants, and ultimately the same experiences. If you search for what to do in Paris, New York, Vienna, or almost anywhere else, you will usually see the same attractions repeated over and over again. And of course, many of those places are absolutely worth seeing. But I have found that some of the most memorable experiences happen when you look a little beyond those lists. Maybe it's a small museum, a local festival, or a quirky roadside attraction that's mostly known only within that region. Those places often tell you just as much about the destination as its famous landmark. You'll also generally find them to be less crowded, and it ends up being more of a unique memory and experience of that place that you're visiting. Over the years, my husband and I realized that this was the kind of travel we enjoy the most. One of my favorite examples of this is Guesthouses in France. We first visited during that Rick Steves tour, and it's the kind of place that we might never have discovered on our own. For the past 29 years, in the middle of the French countryside, a team of craftspeople have been building a medieval castle using the tools, materials, and techniques that would have been used in the 13th century. It's fascinating and completely unique, and it ended up being one of the most memorable parts of the trip. In fact, we enjoyed it so much that 10 years later, we made a special trip back there just to see how much progress had been made. That's the kind of experience that slow travel makes room for. Part of my love for studying history is learning how ordinary people lived their everyday lives, what they ate, how they shopped, how they spent their free time, and what their communities looked like. So it's probably not surprising that one of my favorite things to do is just to observe how people live now. We love visiting local markets and grocery stores and wandering through residential neighborhoods. We'll happily spend an afternoon sitting in a cafe or a park, just people watching, or taking public transportation to see a different, less touristy part of the city. Those things might not make everyone's top list of attractions, but they tell you a lot about a place. You learn what people buy, how they get around, what kinds of homes they live in, how they spend their weekends. You start to get a sense of what everyday life actually feels like there. And in many ways, that's what interests me most and what experiences and memories I hold on to. Because a place is more than just its famous landmark. It's the people who live there and the life that happens around it every day. The older I get, the more I find myself looking to add experiences rather than just seeing sights or attractions when we travel. A cooking class, a local craft workshop, a farm stay, a guided history walk, or just learning a traditional skill can sometimes give you a richer understanding of a place than another afternoon spent rushing between attractions. I still dream of taking a perfume workshop in Grasse, France someday. Those kinds of experiences give you a chance to engage with a place in a different way and come home with a story rather than just a photograph. The slow travel mindset influences more than what we choose to see. It also shapes how we travel and where we stay. We've never been the kind of travelers who need a big resort or a chain hotel. Given the choice, we will usually pick a small boutique hotel, a pension, a chambre d'hôte, or a gîte type of accommodation. Part of this is because we enjoy historic buildings and unique spaces, but it's also because those places often feel more connected to the area that you're visiting. And we enjoy meeting the proprietors of these places. We've met and remained in contact with several people that we've stayed with over the years. Now, if you're from the US, it might help to know that European bed and breakfasts are a little different than what we are used to in the US. Back home, B&Bs tend to be charming, but often fairly expensive themed accommodations that people book for a romantic getaway. In Europe, they are much more often everyday accommodations. Many are family run, quite affordable, and just feel more like staying with locals than staying in a hotel. There's often a more personal feeling to it. You might get a recommendation from people who live there and actually know the area. And sometimes breakfast becomes a conversation with other travelers. You're not just passing through a place, you are spending time in it. These days, one of our favorite ways to travel is to pick a home base and just explore from there. Rather than packing up and moving every day or two, we'll often stay in one area and just take day trips to nearby towns, museums, markets, and historical sites. Part of this is practical. Constantly packing and unpacking gets old very quickly, but it also changes the way you experience a place. You start to learn your way around. You find the bakery that you like. You recognize streets and landmarks. The destination begins to feel a little less like somewhere you're visiting and a little more familiar. Some of our favorite travel days have been spent just driving through the countryside with really no particular destination in mind beyond a few places that looked interesting on a map. We've discovered great antique shops, local markets, historic sites, and just little towns that we probably would never have seen if we had stayed on the main highways. And the nice thing is that this concept doesn't require an international trip. We did this a lot when we still lived in the US. Some of the best day trips we had taken had been really close to home. Sometimes slow travel simply means approaching a familiar place with the same curiosity you would bring to a new one. In some ways, this feels closest to what I imagine travel was like for many people in the past. You arrived someplace, settled in, and just spent time getting to know the area rather than constantly moving on to the next destination. One of the things that I love about vintage travel is how intentionally people documented their journeys. For all our modern technology, I sometimes think that we've become a little less intentional about recording our travels. When I was 12, my grandparents took my cousin and me on a 3-month RV trip to visit national parks around the United States. Every evening after we'd finished exploring for the day, my grandfather had us sit down and write about what we'd done that day. At the time, I wasn't always thrilled about it. After a full day of walking around, sightseeing, and just being a kid, I probably would have preferred doing just about anything else. But he had a reason for it. Along with our daily entries, he collected brochures, maps, photographs, ticket stubs, and just all sorts of paper ephemera from the trip. Then when we got home, he put everything together into a large photo album. And what's funny is that some of my favorite parts aren't the photographs. It's reading what my 12-year-old self thought was important enough to write down. It's the brochures from places I had completely forgotten about. It's the little details that probably would have disappeared from my memory if they just hadn't been collected. I think that's one of the reasons those 3 months still feel so vivid all these years later. We live in a time when it's possible to take hundreds of photos while traveling, and I certainly do my share of that. But there is something special about taking a moment to record an experience in your own words. It doesn't have to be a journal. It could be a simple postcard that you mail to your future self so you have it when you get home. A scrapbook, a notebook, or even just a few notes on your phone. The point isn't to create a perfect record of the trip. It's simply to pay attention to it while you're there. The same thing applies to souvenirs. I've never been much of a souvenir shop person, the rows and rows of magnets and keychains and pretty much anything that could easily be sold somewhere else with just a different city name printed on them. What I find myself looking for instead are things that remind me of the place itself. Maybe it's a piece of pottery made by a local artist, a book, a textile, something handmade. Something that reflects the history, culture, or character of where I've been. Picking up a small item at an antique store or a flea market is always a great way to preserve the memory of your trip. When I look around my home, many of my favorite travel souvenirs aren't expensive or particularly impressive. They're just meaningful because they remind me of a specific place or experience. Years later, that object can bring you right back to that moment. When people talk about slow travel, they often focus on the practical side of it. Taking trains instead of planes, staying longer in one destination, traveling with fewer bags. And those things can certainly be a part of it. But for me, slow travel has always been less about how I get somewhere and more about how I experience it once I arrive. It's wandering through a neighborhood with no particular destination in mind. It's strolling a market and eating the local delicacies. It's taking a day trip to a small town you've never heard of. It's leaving enough room in your plans for something unexpected to happen. The older I get, the more I realize that things I remember most from my travels are rarely the things I scheduled months in advance. They're the discoveries, the conversations, the detours, and the places I wasn't looking for. And maybe that's one of the things that we can borrow from the way people traveled in the past. The understanding that the journey isn't just about reaching a destination. It's about paying attention to the places, people, and experiences we encounter along the way. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What is the most memorable place that you've discovered while traveling that wasn't the reason you took the trip? Was it a small museum, a market, a village, a restaurant, or just something completely unexpected? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy these conversations about vintage living, history, and finding practical inspiration from the past, I would love for you to stick around. Subscribing, liking, sharing, and hyping the video really does help more people find the channel, and it helps me continue making videos like this one. And if you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out the rest of my Vintage Living in a Modern World series. We've explored everything from slowing down and creating more intentional daily routine to vintage homemaking, self-care, and hobbies. You can check out the series playlist here if you'd like to continue the journey. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Safe travels.